today. Today we'll be dealing with the kinds of scale that you'd find in an atlas, whether it is a world map, a regional map, or a local map. But before we carry on, we need to just recap on what is our understanding of a map. As you know, a map is a graphical representation of actual reality. So you can have a map represented on the form of a paper which you'd find on an atlas, in the form of a topographical map, in the form of a world chart, or even in the form of a GPS. So in many actual day-to-day activities, we are coming across some form of mapping, whether it is helping ourselves to locate certain places using our GPS in our cars, or whether it's in the form of an app asking you to enable its actual location. Before we carry on, let us recap on certain concepts that we've done when we dealt with an atlas in our previous lesson. First of all, we need to understand what is the meaning of the term when you come to using the word index. What does the word index mean? An index, as you may recall, is an alphabetical list of names, subjects with reference to the pages on which you can find it on. The other word that I've mentioned before is an atlas. An atlas is a book of maps or charts that will have the location of many different countries as well as continents. You need to also understand what the term location means. Location refers to a place or a position on a particular map. And then also when it comes to your index in using an atlas, there are two different concepts that are constantly referred to. The first concept is the illustration of information on a row form, as well as the giving the information in a column form. The difference between the two is, if you look at a row refers to information represented horizontally, while a column refers to information represented vertically. If you look at the concept that we'll be covering in today's lesson, we are going to be making reference of the term scale on a regular basis. So for you to understand this particular content well, you need to have a good comprehensive understanding of the term scale. Again, what is the meaning of the word scale? As mentioned earlier, scale is the representation of the actual relationship between reality represented in a ratio form. For example, if there was no such thing as a scale used when it has come to mapping a particular area, you would have to have a sheet of paper that would be the same size of the area you're representing. For example, if there was no scale and you had to represent a graphic representation of the earth, your piece of paper that you would have to represent the earth would have been the size of the actual earth. Can you imagine how cumbersome that must have been? And let us not forget how many trees we'd have need to have chopped down to make one particular map. So as you can surely understand, scale is essential for downsizing the actual representation of reality. There will be a few questions related to this particular content that we'll cover on a later basis on how scale will vary from a regional map down to a local map. If you can look at the representation of what an index looks like, you can see on this illustration that if you look at the information represented on a linear form when it comes to index, you can look at this information. It's giving you the name of the feature, it's giving you the type of feature, it's giving you the country where you find the feature, and it's giving you a series of numbers. You can see, for example, it's giving you latitude, longitude, as well as your direction in which you can find that place. Now you need to remember, when it comes to your latitude and longitude, when you are given latitude and longitude, you always have to represent latitude first. That is the key information. If you are given a question where they're asking you for coordinates, remember latitude must always be given first. Right, when you're giving latitude, what do you need to give first? You need to give your degrees, you need to give your minutes, and you need to give your seconds, as well as the hemisphere in which this particular reference is found. Okay, the same goes for longitude. Longitude is also given as your degrees first, followed by minutes, then seconds, as well as the hemisphere. In other words, whether it is on the eastern side of the Greenwich meridian or whether it is on the western side of the Greenwich meridian. And just to recap again, when giving coordinates, latitude is always given before longitude. Okay, coming back to the issue of scale. If you look at scale, in an atlas, a person will find maps that represents a different amount of land area. For example, different maps are represented with different scales. You can either have in an atlas some representation, for example, of the globe itself, where you're looking at all the continents represented on one graphic representation, or alternatively, you can be having in that same atlas a graphical representation of a continent, or on another page there can be a graphical representation of a country, and then further, as you're going deeper into the atlas, you can have a representation of a particular city. So as you can notice, you can getting different sizes of different parts of the earth represented, all using different types of scale. So if you look at, again, just to summarize, scale means making things smaller and making things a bit easier to use. So always when you're looking at maps, maps are always drawn to scale. It is only that the scale sizes are differing from map to map. So to summarize what a scale is, a scale shows the relationship between the map distance and the ground distance. So to look at it again, your scale can be represented as what is the map distance representation of what the actual distance is. Before we carry on, we need to understand the key differences. Remember, I told you that you can look at scale represented on a larger area or a larger surface where it shows a continent, or it could looking at a more detailed area where it is showing an actual city, for example. So you need to understand what scale is used to represent a large surface area, and you also need to look at what type of scale is used to represent a smaller surface area. So those two type of different scales are known as a large scale map and a small scale map. On a small scale map, features appear smaller, and on a large scale map, features appear larger. So if you look at the representation on the diagram that will be projected, if you look at the small scale map, it is giving you a representation over a large area. So in other words, you might be able to see many cities and many towns represented on that map. If you look at, for example, on a large scale map, this is covering a smaller area. So you're not covering a large surface area, but you are covering, for example, one particular city or one particular town. So you're not seeing, as in the case of a small scale map, a number of cities. So let's look at more information regarding small scale maps. So again, a small scale map shows a large area of the Earth's surface. So small scale map shows very little detail. So a good example of a small scale map would be a world chart where you can see all the continents represented on one particular map. And if you look at an example of a small scale map or a world map that you can see on many classroom walls, you will notice that you're not seeing any particular detail about cities or smaller towns. If you look at yourself, look at that particular map, can you see your particular suburb? Obviously not, because there is not too much detail. So it's covering a large surface area. Another way to explain it is, if you look at this particular example of a small scale map, this small scale map, the representation is, the ratio used is 1:4 million. What does that mean? It means that 1 centimeter on the map is equal to 4 million centimeters in reality. So that is a particular ratio that is being used. So 1 centimeter on the map is represented with 4 million centimeters in reality on the ground. A large scale map, on the other hand, gives you so much more detail. On these particular maps, you can now start to determine, for example, you can start seeing street names, you can start seeing the name of a particular suburbs. So it is showing you so much more detail of a particular place, but it is covering a smaller area. Now you'll remember on the previous example I showed you, it was a scale represented showing a world map. If you're looking at a large scale map, it is showing you, for example, a mapped area of a small suburb where you start to seeing different types of street areas, different types of features such as hospitals and those type of things as well. A good example is that if you look at the type of scale represented with this particular map is, the scale represented here is 1:10,000. So in other words, 1 centimeter on the ground represents 10,000 centimeters on reality. And if you compare it to the previous map was 1:4 million, this one is only 1:10,000. So you can see that if you're comparing the two different types of scale, the one has a larger number representation while the other one has a smaller number representation as well. So we need to look at the different types of maps that are represented on an atlas. An atlas, for example, starts off with having regional maps. So regional maps are considered to be between small scale as well as large scale maps. So if you look at the different types of example when it comes to scale, the scale of a regional map can range from 1:500,000 to up to 1:250,000 centimeters. So if you look at, for example, a regional scale shows you a particular region, whether it is a series of provinces or in the case of the US, a particular range of states. So it's covering more or less a big part of different types of continents. You will not be able to look at, for example, cities in detail, but it will give you the differentiation between different types of provinces and states. And then if you go to your different types, if you go to your large scale map, you're looking at, for example, the regional map is showing you a particular region where you're looking at focusing on one particular province. And that one, the scale ranges up to a period of anything below 1:250,000. And then lastly, the scale that has the most detail when it comes to an atlas would be, for example, a local scale map. Now, a local scale map generally has anything between a scale of 1:10,000 up to 1:50,000. Now, if you look at now this particular activity, you need to be able to differentiate the type of question and characterization and features to differentiate between the different scales. A typical question would be, in the exam would be, could you explain the difference between a large scale map and a small scale map? I have a flow chart illustrated here. This is the type of questions that you will be asked to consider when completing a particular activity. So if you look at the flow chart that I have with me here, it's asking you, if you're looking at a small scale map, give us the type of area that is represented, the detail that is represented, an example of this type of small scale map, and give us an example of the type of ratio when it comes to your small scale map. So if you look at it like this, a small scale map represents a larger area. And another feature of this small scale map is that it has little detail, and an example of it is a world map. If you're looking at the type of scale that a small scale map has, a good example, as mentioned earlier, is a typical example would be 1:4 million. Coming to a large scale map. What is a large scale map? Can you give a definition of the type of area that it covers, an example of the detail as well as an example of what type of map it is, and then also adding what type of scale is represented. So if you're looking at a large scale map is representing a smaller area. It covers much more detail as compared to a small scale map. An example of a large scale map is that it represents a local area or a local map, and the typical type of scale that you're talking about here is 1:50,000. So as you progress with your terms work and leading up to further down the line in your schooling, you will know that you are going to engage quite a bit with a large scale map. Good examples of large scale maps are your typical topographical maps that you will be using, as well as an example is your aerial photograph or your orthophotograph map that you'll be using. Those are examples of large scale maps. So just to summarize one more time, to look at your differences between a small scale map and a large scale map. Now this is key. Like we said earlier, the typical example of a small scale map is that it is your type of world chart that you find in many classrooms. In other words, the one that has the total representation of all your particular continents. And a good example of that is, if you look at it, it covers a large area. Remember, it's covering the whole globe. So it's covering a large surface area, but you're not getting a lot of detail. So remember, small scale maps, large surface area, very little detail. And a good typical example of a small scale map is it will have a large number when you come to represent it as a ratio. For example, 1:4 million. That is a good example of a small scale map. On the other hand, if you're looking at a large scale map, remember what we said, large scale maps is covering a smaller area. Don't get confused by it. It's called large because you're getting so much more detail on that particular map. So it is covering a smaller area. And also you're getting so much more detail. We said the example that you're looking at is, if you're looking at the typical large scale map, is you should be able to start seeing street names, name of suburbs, those type of things. So it is covering a smaller area, but it has much more detail. And the typical example of a large scale map ratio scale would be, for example, either 1:10,000 and 1:50,000. So learners, remember, many times learners are getting confused, or you're getting confused when you're looking at the term large, but you're seeing a smaller number. 50,000 is smaller than 4 million. But remember, the smaller the number, it is known as a large scale map. So if you're comparing two particular numbers, you're comparing 1:4 million and you're comparing 1:50,000. The smaller number is known as a large scale map. The bigger number, the 4 million, is known as a small scale map. Remember that. So that is your differences between large scale maps and small scale maps. The key feature is, remember the difference in ratio sizes like I explained, and then also the key feature to remember is the bigger the number, it means that it's covering a larger area, but it has less detail. The smaller the number, 1:50,000, it covers a larger area, it covers a smaller area, but it has so much more detail. So that is the difference. So you could have the difference is a regional map and it is compared to a local map. But you can only do the differences when you're comparing two different maps between a large scale and a small scale map. I thank you.